In 1972, astronomer Dr. J. Allen Hynek detailed a system of categorizing UFO observations he dubbed close encounters. Strictly speaking, a close encounter differs from a sighting via a physical relationship between a witness and UFO, a UFO being defined as a structured craft-like object and not simply a strange light in the night sky. To be considered a close encounter, a UFO must be within 150 meters, or about 500 feet, of the point of observation. At distances greater than this, there is a significant chance of misidentification due to several factors, including atmospheric haze, insufficient ambient light, and foreground obstacles. Note that a close encounter also does not necessarily mean extraterrestrial, nor does the simple act of classification prove it objectively true in any way. Reports must be carefully evaluated to distinguish a UFO's actual nature from opinions held by the witnesses. If one observes an unusual, though completely terrestrial aircraft, perhaps something experimental or as yet unfamiliar, one may understandably conclude that it is something not of this earth, and yet still be mistaken. Imagine the report a country farmer might have made in the late 18th century as a newly invented hot air balloon drifted mysteriously over a misty field. The close encounter classification system can be a useful tool for skeptics as well as proponents. Patterns eventually emerge, if not physical, then certainly psychological. Someone who believes UFOs and related phenomena are otherworldly visitations might notice clusters of observations near certain points of interest, such as nuclear weapons facilities, while one who believes them to be hallucinations or delusions may see links to social isolation or even exposure to unconnected stimuli. Since its inception by Dr. Hynek, alternative versions of the close encounter system have arisen, as the system itself has been reformed to align philosophically with different researchers. These variations are not particularly significant, as they cover the same ground in one way or another, although more modern versions do tend to encompass purely psychological experiences as well as physical. In all cases, each kind of encounter is significantly rarer than the one preceding it. A close encounter of the first kind is the observation of a structured craft of unknown origin, which interacts with the surrounding environment in some meaningful way: sounds, atmospheric turbulence, heat, etc. Entities, that is, animated figures, humanoid or otherwise, are never seen during the encounter. Most famous UFO photos fall into this category, as they usually accompany reports of strange sounds or unexplained wind, such as the pair of exposures taken in McMinnville, Oregon in 1950. A close encounter of the second kind leaves behind a lingering physical effect after departure. A witness mysteriously suffering radiation sickness or unexplained sunburn would be an example, as would surface indentations corresponding to observed landing pads. As with CE-1s, no entities are witnessed at any time. The Falcon Lake incident in May of 1967 would be a notable example. The primary witness, Stephen Michalak, was supposedly burned by the exhaust from a landed craft. Close encounters of the third kind are specifically observations of an entity associated with an unknown craft. Whether inside or outside of said craft, the entity is either unaware of or unconcerned with a witness, and therefore no communication takes place. As noted by UFO researcher Ted Blocher, the location of the entities during a CE-3 should be considered, as it may lend credence to the sighting via context. Is the entity observed only inside the craft, through a porthole or cupola, or is an entity only seen outside the craft? Oddly, because CE-3s are focused on the presence of an entity and not a craft, a strange creature seen in an area is sometimes interpreted as a CE-3, even if no UFO is present at the time. Just what a UFO occupant is supposed to look like is a matter of opinion, and it is not clear why a witness would immediately connect a mysterious creature with something that wasn't there. Of course, if one were to witness a creature near a UFO, and then see the same or similar thing later without the accompanying craft, a logical connection could be made. Close encounters of the fourth kind are typically defined as direct communication of some form between witnesses and entities. It is not necessary for the communication to be verbal. An entity merely waving to a witness, a surprisingly common reported occurrence, would qualify. Some interpretations classify CE-4s exclusively as cases where individuals are abducted by UFO occupants, but this ignores the context of each report. Abducting someone is, in a way, communication, if only to communicate "come with me." But we shouldn't discount the physical or mental differences between those who claim to be willing abductees, such as Betty and Barney Hill, who more or less entered a landed craft under their own power, and unwilling ones, like the two Pascagoula men forcibly dragged into a craft for examination. To deal with some of these vagaries, investigators Jenny Randles and Peter Warrington further categorize CE4s into 4 subtypes. These subtypes are occasionally lumped together into close encounters of the 5th kind, but as the origins and implications of each subtype are qualitatively different, this is probably somewhat overly reductive. Type A are straightforward contacts, those that are typically depicted in film and television. The phenomenon of missing time is usually not experienced, and most, if not all, recollections of the contact are of a conscious nature. Type B are often dubbed bedroom visitors, and are probably not related to the subject of UFOs, as they are, almost without exception, experienced by a single individual, and are therefore totally subjective. These encounters share a great deal of qualities with hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations, and in pre-technological eras would have been likely seen as hauntings. Type C are contacts that are not consciously recalled, but are brought out only through artificial means, such as regressive hypnosis. As one would imagine, confabulation and errant memories are inherent in these claims, and absurd conclusions can sometimes be reached, i.e., I know a UFO was in my backyard because I couldn't see it. Type D are defined as contacts that are made consciously, but via remote received telepathic messages, something akin to channeling. Obviously, this has much more in common with the trappings of the human subconscious than any UFO sighting. But since Type D claimants routinely cite alien beings, there seems to be enough relationship within the phenomenon to warrant a listing. Most CE4s of subtypes B, C, and D are at best fodder for psychologists. There could be something objectively real about any of them, but since the only evidence we have to go by is the claimant's own testimony, there is little chance of producing additional evidence through investigation. Type A CE4s are a bit different. Certainly many boil down to only one person's tale of misadventure, but on rare occasion, independent corroborations occur through unconnected witnesses or circumstantial context. Honest assessments will search for prosaic explanations, but acknowledge the limits of those explanations. One of the more curious cases of close encounters of the 4th kind is of that having occurred in Ririe, Idaho in late 1967. The case involves claims that can both be simultaneously described as terrifying and ridiculous. Many will undoubtedly dismiss the event as either a tissue of lies or a narrative born of a diseased mind. This is not necessarily the case. On Thursday, November 2nd, at approximately 9:30 p.m., 23-year-old Guy Tossie and 23-year-old Willie Begay, both members of the Navajo Nation and employees of the Earl Hunter Farm, were driving southwest on State Route 26 toward Idaho Falls in a white 1956 Buick sedan, Begay at the wheel. The moon was new and the sky full of stars and the typical nighttime chill found during autumns in the Gem State. The young men had spent an evening in the town of Ririe, a small bedroom community of less than 600 residents, drinking beer at the town bar to unwind after a hard day of work. The men later reported that about a quarter of a mile outside of town, a flash of light suddenly enveloped their car and momentarily blinded them. The event was so startling that at first they thought their car had been struck by a bolt of lightning. Once their eyes cleared, Mr. Begay and Mr. Tossie saw a strange 5 to 8 foot wide object blocking the highway directly ahead, hovering about 5 feet above the pavement. Though Begay recalled never touching the brake, the car slowed and came to a complete stop a short distance away, the headlamps and engine continuing to function as normal. Later, both men described the object as having flashing green and orange lights through holes in a ring at its center joint. The ring slowly rotated around the object's axis, and the top of the object was comprised either partially or completely of a transparent dome. Within this dome, the men could just make out a pair of small, seated humanoid forms, one of them apparently gazing down at them, and the other, in profile, watching his strange companion. The dome suddenly opened as if hinged on one side. One of the creatures rose from his chair and floated out into the night, directly down to the driver's side door of the Buick. The men later described the creature to local NICAP investigator Clarence Ricks, a summary of which is as follows. The creature had a very deep chest and had a head about 6 inches in diameter. There was no discernible nose on its face, though it did have small circular eyes. A pair of large, round ears were set high on the side of its head, and a simple lipless slit made for a mouth. It had skin that resembled a rough cantaloupe, though neither men could recall the color, partly due to the constant barrage of green and orange lighting from the rotating rim of the UFO, and partly from an inability to overcome their own stark terror. The thing wore a tight-fitting uniform of sorts, similar to coveralls, and carried a flat device like a thin rucksack on its back, the upper portion of which protruded above its head. The men also noted the creature's hands only seemed to have 2 fingers, although their report is not clear whether these were in place of or in addition to opposable thumbs. Things went from bad to much, much worse as the creature nonchalantly opened the car door and started to climb aboard. Mr. Begay immediately scrambled toward his friend, practically perching on his lap as they both watched the creature grab the steering wheel. The dome closed on the UFO, and the car began to slowly move, the creature deftly steering the car off the road and into a field of wheat stubble. Later, neither man could recall the diminutive creature operating the accelerator or brake pedal, but it was entirely possible the Buick was somehow being towed by the UFO, as it maintained a fixed position in relation to the car at all times throughout the maneuver. About 75 feet into the field, the car bumped to a stop, and in a sudden and quite relatable act of desperation, Mr. Tossie tore open the passenger door and bolted toward the highway. It is often reported that the second occupant of the UFO gave chase, as Mr. Tossie later described seeing his shadow projected ahead of him on the road, presumably from a pursuer's light. This is entirely unfounded, as neither Begay nor Tossie ever mentioned the location or actions of the second creature at any time beyond the initial observation. Mr. Tossie's shadow could just as easily be explained as a result of the UFO's illumination of the general area. Back in the car, Mr. Begay's night was growing ever stranger. He was, as one might imagine, frozen from fear, on the verge of shock, watching the strange little man with beady eyes turn toward him and, apparently, speak to him with what he later described as a rapid, high-pitched, chirping, warbling sound. Receiving no meaningful response, as Mr. Begay was in no mood to talk, the creature repeated his statement, or question, exited the car through the driver's side door, and floated up toward the UFO, the dome of which had apparently reopened. The creature returned to his point of origin. Mr. Begay makes no mention of the second entity. The dome closed once more, and the UFO rose into the air in a zigzag motion, a flame-like jet emanating from its underside. With what sounded like a great rush of air, the UFO then increased in brightness and accelerated upwards until lost from view. Around 9:40 p.m., Farmer William Hammond and his teenaged son, Robert, opened the front door of their residence in response to a frantic banging. Mr. Hammond was confronted with what he later described as, quote, an incoherent Indian, unquote, and quickly let him inside in an effort to calm him down. It should be noted that Mr. Hammond noticed the scent of beer on the air, but he did not believe the stranger to be intoxicated. After several minutes, Mr. Tossie finally collected himself enough to explain that a mysterious light had driven their car off the road and how he was sure his friend was dead. There was no indication he mentioned anything about UFO occupants, but as one can imagine, Mr. Hammond and his son were quite skeptical nonetheless. Truthful or not, the farmer could see Mr. Tossie was genuinely terrified, and he offered to take him back to the scene. Despite repeated refusals, Mr. Tossie eventually agreed, and the 3 men took the Hammond vehicle to the wheat field, the UFO having since departed. The Buick was still idling and the headlamps were still on. The 3 men found Mr. Begay sitting behind the steering wheel, trembling, his eyes tightly closed. As soon as Mr. Begay realized the terrestrial nature of his new visitors, he responded with some relief and related his own versions of the events, which by now had begun between 15 and 20 minutes prior. After a brief discussion, it was decided the Hammonds would follow Begay and Tossie partway home in case something else happened. They did so, and after a few moments, Mr. Hammond determined the men would be all right on their own, and turned back toward Ririe to grab some coffee with his son at the local bar, likely the very same bar that Begay and Tossie had visited earlier. A few minutes into the refreshments, a deputy sheriff and town constable entered the bar to grab some mid-shift lunch, followed closely by Mr. Begay and Mr. Tossie, who had decided against going back to their respective homes and spending a nerve-wracking night all alone. Noticing the lawmen, the 2 nervous friends quickly related the evening's goings-on, with Mr. Hammond confirming his participation. This is perhaps more than a minor point of interest. In that era, young Native American men would be somewhat reticent about speaking to non-Native police, unless absolutely necessary. This is not a case of anything being intrinsically wrong with either the young Navajo men or the police, but more the acknowledgement of inherent cultural distrust. The fact that Tossie and Begay were eager to share such a bizarre tale to who were, from their perspective, a duplicitous authority is noteworthy. To their credit, the deputy and constable found the men to be sincere enough to look into the matter further. Considering the weird nature of the narrative, it is highly doubtful they took the men at face value, and probably considered the incident to be an elaborate and possibly dangerous attempt at car theft, and the two men confused victims. The Idaho State Police were duly contacted, and about an hour later, a Corporal Tom Harper of the ISP arrived to investigate. As Tossie and Begay once again told their story, Harper inspected their Buick, visually checking for signs of damage. He apparently was under the mistaken impression that the UFO had landed directly onto the hood. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and though Corporal Harper noted the two men had freely admitted to consuming alcohol before the incident, he emphasized they did not appear intoxicated in any way. They did, however, appear to be very frightened. The story would have undoubtedly ended then and there, a spooky tale of which the only evidence, if one could call it such, were the wild, possibly sincere, recollections of two young men who had both admitted to drinking. Word of the encounter reached Idaho Falls resident Clarence Reed Ricks, local investigator for NICAP, the National Investigations Committee of Aerial Phenomena, who quickly uncovered a nebula of interesting information. Mrs. Rita Barnes, a shopkeeper in Ririe and friend of Mr. Begay, reported a number of frightened animals, including dogs and cattle, during the evening of November the 2nd. This was echoed by Mrs. Claude Mann, who claimed on the night in question her cattle had become very agitated, eventually breaching a steel gate, scattering up to 2 miles away. When finally corralled, they remained so agitated that they soon broke loose a second time. Curious, but notably Ricks acknowledged that these incidents might be purely coincidental. At around 11:30 p.m. on the 2nd, a Mrs. Eileen Quinn, who lived in the Snake River Valley approximately 6 miles east of Ririe, had left home to visit a nearby relative. She witnessed what she described as a rotating, zigzagging orange light to the east. She estimated the light to be about 2 miles distant, though it should be noted that it is very difficult to accurately gauge distance at night. When interviewing Mrs. Quinn about her sighting, Ricks discovered she wasn't aware of the Tossie and Begay encounter, but she did know of another similar encounter near the town of Rigby, a town about 10 miles northwest of Ririe. Following this lead, Ricks managed to locate the individual who claimed to have the encounter. Unfortunately, he was very hesitant to relate his tale, fearful of the resulting social repercussions, and insisted on remaining anonymous. Ricks referred to the man as Mr. X, a pseudonym perhaps more suited to a spy novel than paranormal investigation. Quote, "Although he is employed as a skilled laborer, he reads extensively and otherwise shows the outward signs of an active intellect, with average or above intelligence. He is very afraid that if his story gets out, he will be ridiculed." Unquote. On the evening of November 2nd, 1967, Mr. X, resident of Rigby, was at a bar in Ririe, drowning his sorrows over his recent divorce. He was not normally a drinker, but desperate for relief, a few beers seemed, at least at the time, to be the best prescription for his troubles. At about 11:30, he boarded his pickup truck and started down State Highway 48 toward Rigby, a dark and lonely stretch of road. Halfway home, a strange object came down in front of him. Although the vagueness of the description is possibly due to the deleterious effects of alcohol on Mr. X's memory, it is notably less dramatic than the flash of lightning described by Tossie and Begay. Mr. X's truck immediately stopped. It is not clear if this was his doing or the object's, and he watched, baffled, as a small humanoid being exited the object. Again, exactly how this happened isn't clear. The being walked up to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass, then scratched the windshield in a manner Mr. X took as a bid to get him to open the door. Interestingly, there was no attempt at verbal communication by either party at any time. Mr. X came to his senses and sped away, ultimately spending the night tossing and turning in bed, thinking he had either lost his sanity or was now the prime target of weird little men from space. About 7 a.m. the following morning, Mr. X told his co-worker about his experience, and asked his friend if he thought he was crazy. His friend, who was also questioned by Clarence Ricks, assured Mr. X that he was sane and recalled that upon hearing a short radio news report 2 hours later concerning Tossie and Begay's experience, Mr. X turned, quote, white as a sheet, unquote. Ricks attempted a follow-up interview with Mr. X a year later, but discovered he had moved to Alaska, leaving no means of further contact. Skeptics familiar with the Ririe encounter often point out the suspicious anonymity of the corroborating witness, Mr. X. This is very justifiable, as corroboration after the fact, even with a named individual, is suspect, for obvious reasons. It's unlikely Clarence Ricks would create the story as some sort of validation to another equally far-fetched story. Besides, Ricks looked into the tale of Mr. X at the suggestion of Elaine Quinn, so one can only conclude the story did not originate with him, unless one is also willing to say Elaine Quinn was also a fabrication. Ricks was well regarded within NICAP and dutifully investigated several UFO sightings for the organization around the Idaho Falls area between 1951 and 1968. He was known to voraciously read material on the subject and to be very hands-on, even driving to witness locations in the middle of the night for interviews. One may choose to brand him credulous, which is not necessarily accurate, as great interest in a subject does not automatically make one a true believer, but there is simply no evidence for dishonesty. Of course, it isn't necessary to brand any investigator a liar for Mr. X to be the product of fiction. Mr. X could be a very real person who simply lied about his own encounter, although this interpretation is not without problems. If Mr. X is lying, he would essentially be admitting to being both emotionally weak and psychologically unstable, at least from his standpoint. While this is certainly not impossible, even for a man in 1960s Idaho, one does have to wonder what his motivation would be, apart from simply seeking attention. But if Mr. X wanted attention, why would he insist on anonymity? If Mr. X is not lying, one is forced to explain the origins of two very weird accounts, which have very similar circumstances and are not causally connected. Indeed, the physiological reaction Mr. X had to the morning radio report that was observed by his friend implies Mr. X was in fact deeply affected by the memory of something he at least considered external. It is also possible Mr. X suffered some sort of delusion and sincerely believed his own tale to be true, but then one has to wonder just how he could imagine a scenario that more or less mimics another tale told by other men that he couldn't possibly have independent foreknowledge of. Clearly, the 1967 Ririe, Idaho encounter is one of the more dramatic examples of a close encounter of the fourth kind. As such, one should examine the possible explanations, as those might be useful in explaining other such claims. Considering the dearth of information regarding the Ririe encounter, indeed very little is to be found on the internet, one is tempted to dismiss the entire affair as little more than unsubstantiated rumor. Maybe it simply didn't happen. The idea is not without precedent. A popular close encounter story one can find, quite easily in fact, concerns an event at Ellsworth Air Force Base, often misnamed Allsworth, in South Dakota. Based on a seemingly official USAF document sent to the Lantana, Florida office of the National Enquirer, the story usually goes that at 10:59 p.m., November 16, 1977, Airman First Class Kenneth Jenkins and Airman First Class Wayne Rake were dispatched to investigate an alarm on the Lima 9 missile silo. At the fence line, the men encountered a strange man dressed in a glowing green uniform and helmet. Reactively, Airman Rake aimed his M16 service rifle, which the stranger promptly disintegrated, an act which severely burned the airman's hands, using some sort of handheld device. Around this point, two more strangers arrived, and a somewhat lopsided battle ensued, in which Jenkins either dodged another discharge from the nondescript beam weapon, or, as another version has it, fired upon the strangers, who retreated over a hill unharmed. In all cases, the three beings then boarded a 20-foot-wide hovering disc-like UFO, which sped off. As seeming corroboration, Rake is said to have suffered third-degree burns and had detectable levels of radiation on his body. Unfortunately, the story is neither plausible nor true in any sense. Ellsworth Air Force Base has been the subject of a well-known close encounter, but that was several years earlier in 1953, and amounted to little more than a radar contact and a visual sighting at some distance by an F-84 pilot. An investigation by the National Enquirer uncovered several blatant inconsistencies. Although there were men named Rake and Jenkins on the base, their ranks and duties were completely incorrect. In fact, none of the other names involved, including those listed on the cover page of the supposed Air Force document that started the whole affair, were correct. Neither the real Jenkins nor the real Rake knew each other. No hill existed at or near the place of the supposed encounter. There was no record of Rake ever suffering an injury. No one on the base, nor anyone in the nearby community of Rapid City, knew of anything related to the event. If such a security alarm had taken place, the entire base, as well as the town, would have been aware of it. There was also the plain fact that the aliens in the story seemed contrived, existing only for the benefit of the story. Everything they did was purely reactive. Also, it seems highly unlikely the U.S. Air Force would be so nonplussed about having such open aggression shown toward two of its airmen. At minimum, the base would have remained on high alert for some time afterward. The narrative of the Ririe Encounter, though little known, does not suffer the same problems. Most of the named individuals exist in the context in which they are given, at least as far as research of old records is able to confirm. And although even diligent research will not confirm every fact, the case is nearly 60 years old after all. Enough of the major points can be substantiated to satisfy all but the most jaded skeptics. The case was written about in a local newspaper, authored by a Ms. Marie Anderson and the now-defunct Shelley Pioneer, and was investigated by NICAP, an organization which, though one may find their subject matter hard to swallow, has never been known for outright fabrication or chasing demonstrable phantoms. There is no way to absolutely prove the Tossie and Begay encounter happened, just as there is no way to prove 1,000 other events from the same era. Even if objectively true, the encounter would not be found credible by most, so it would be unlikely to be recorded for posterity, as it wouldn't be widely viewed as historically significant. It was pointed out on more than one occasion that Mr. Tossie and Mr. Begay were deeply frightened. Could this have been a ruse? Convincingly feigning any strong emotion is possible for brief periods of time, but the mental energy needed to continue such a charade for several hours is beyond what is typically humanly possible. Great fear also surfaces in obvious involuntary physical manifestations, including trembling, sweating, and hyperventilation. It is likely the opinions of those who interacted with Tossie and Begay, notably William Hammond, Robert Hammond, and Corporal Tom Harper, were at least partly based on observations of these manifestations, implying Begay and Tossie were said to be scared simply because they were. There is the possibility some other party was deceiving the men, though this doesn't seem plausible given the dramatic and bizarre nature of the events. The amount of effort and planning needed to convincingly pull off such a stunt is beyond comprehension. Even if one assumes such a thing were plausible, one would have a very hard time explaining how the entire production was completely dismantled by the time William Hammond arrived at the scene 15 or 20 minutes after it began. Of course, we could always entertain the idea that Mr. Hammond himself was involved in the deception, but that would be the first of many stops on the road to the big conspiracy, more ludicrous than Carjackers from outer space. The role alcohol may have played cannot be ignored, but it can be overblown. Corporal Harper and Mr. Hammond both commented about the smell of beer on Begay and Tossie, which the men freely admitted to indulging in before their encounter. Exactly how much was consumed or the time span of said consumption is never broached, but it was apparently not in such quantity or with such zeal as to place either of them in danger of nightmarish hallucinations. How many beers did Begay and Tossie each drink? How long were they at the bar? Were they eating snacks at the time, a behavior which would significantly change the rate at which the alcohol was absorbed? To reach a blood alcohol content of 0.08%, an average man of about 190 pounds would need to consume between 48 and 60 ounces of beer within the course of an hour. And while any amount of alcohol can impair speech, movement, judgment, and self-awareness, a considerable amount over an extended period of time is typically needed to affect a man enough to create hallucinations and delusions, although there are rare idiosyncratic exceptions. Alcoholic hallucinosis, as the condition is called, usually presents itself as auditory hallucinations, delusions, and severe mood swings, all during full consciousness. As the condition progresses, symptoms resembling those seen in schizophrenia are not uncommon. One should note this is at odds with the more commonly known condition delirium tremens, or the DTs, which arises from the withdrawals of chronic alcoholic consumption and not its ingestion. All this seems a reasonable explanation until one considers the events that transpired at 9:30 centered around not one, but two men. They both claimed to experience the same flash of light, Both claimed to see the same object. Both claimed a weird little man climbed aboard and absconded with their car without any gap in recall. Both men had similar visceral reactions. Both men related their individual narratives in a way which were cross-consistent. This is markedly different than other close encounter cases, such as that experienced by two men in Pascagoula, Mississippi in 1973. In that event, one man claimed to fall unconscious shortly after the encounter began, and thus had much less detailed recollections, which could have been the result of a reconstruction based on the other's insistence. One interesting theory suggests that Tossie and Begay, who were both members of the Navajo tribe, had a genetic predisposition toward the effects of alcohol, and that predisposition caused an extreme reaction in the form of a vivid hallucination. Unfortunately, this theory is partly based on a common misconception known as the firewater myth. The firewater myth holds that Native Americans have an inbred intolerance for alcohol. Clinical experimentation has suggested that, quote, individuals with a greater percentage of Native American heritage may be less sensitive to the subjective effects of alcohol than individuals with a smaller percentage of Native American heritage, unquote. Despite having similar levels of blood alcohol content to non-native counterparts, Native Americans do not seem to experience as much effects. Ironically, this likely leads to greater incidence of alcoholism within the Native American population, as it takes a larger volume of booze to achieve the same buzz. Regardless, these conclusions are based on aggregate populations, not specific people. Not all Native Americans are alcoholics, and there is no reason to believe either Tossie or Begay had any special limitations. Since we have so little information on either men's long-term drinking habits, the best that can be said about alcohol as an explanation is possible, but not probable. Begay and Tossie could have experienced a folie à deux, one man's psyche feeding off the other's, with almost nothing remembered by either objectively real. If one ignores the testimony of Mr. X, which may or may not have been relevant, the only real corroboration of either Begay's or Tossie's testimony is the other man. A folie à deux, a phenomenon in which a pair of individuals collectively share a convincing delusion, is well known in psychological circles, occasionally used as a legal defense to indicate mental defect. These shared delusions can range from the relatively minor, a married couple unrealistically expecting to win a sweepstakes one of them have entered, to the horrifying, the commission of torture and murder, such as that by Nebraskan cult members Michael and Dennis Ryan. The dynamic of a folie à deux centers around one individual being a primary and one being a secondary, or secondaries if a multiple of people are involved. As stated by forensic psychiatrist Brian Haloida, quote, primaries tend to be more dominant in the relationship, whereas secondaries are passive and receptive to the primary's delusional material and directives, unquote. In other words, one party within a folie à deux will, because of some psychological malady, harbor an intense delusion that another party, with whom they share a strong emotional bond, will play along with, eventually becoming just as deluded. A folie à deux centers around individuals in an asymmetric relationship, even if purely platonic. A priest and congregate, an adult and child, a teacher and student, anyone in a position of authority, and a person in direct subordination. There's nothing to suggest that Tossie and Begay were in such a relationship. Both men had full memories of the entire event, suggesting neither had to be coached into believing something the other claimed. There is the possibility that the men were experiencing some form of lucid dream, or experienced hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations that mimicked a folie à deux. If the men were drowsy, not hard to imagine considering they both had a full day of farm work, both had consumed beer, and both proceeded down a lonely road almost 4 hours after sunset, at least one of them could have fallen asleep and had a very quick, very vivid dream. If the other man was similarly on the edge of sleep, he could have been highly suggestible and may have reacted badly to a relayed nightmare. Although the fact that this dream fantasy seemed to last for several minutes, even remaining fully convincing after the men continued down their own respective narrative streams that miraculously seemed to merge consistently at a later time, would seem to indicate something else is going on. Most rational people would eschew the conclusion that Mr. Begay and Mr. Tossie, and by extension Mr. X, had actually experienced an objectively real event. After all, one only has the stories of 3, at least partially inebriated men as evidence. Then again, just because this is the only evidence doesn't mean it's false. Unbelievable or not, all of the behaviors exhibited by Begay and Tossie would be explained if the claims were 100% true. There is nothing out-and-out impossible within the narrative. Even the supposed instantaneous appearance of the UFO on the highway could easily be explained by the momentary inattentiveness a driver typically experiences on a dark stretch of road. A very strange object swooping in from above and behind might seem to appear out of nowhere in a flash. The subsequent behaviors exhibited by the two spacemen are not that bizarre either. The seeming anti-gravitational movements, i.e. floating, could be explained as a misinterpretation by Tossie and Begay, or the use of an exotic technology, though the latter is a poor line of reasoning, little better than a Clarkian interpretation of magic. The absconding of the Buick and successive attempts to communicate with Begay are strange, but not unreasonable actions. There's no way to know if the men were even the focus of the whole endeavor. The UFO crew may have wanted to examine the car. The men were just an inconvenience. Indeed, despite the deluge of palpable fear, no attempt to harm or capture the men was ever claimed. It is often claimed that the second UFOnaut chased Tossie as he ran for safety, but there is no evidence to support this. To further the point, Begay was left alone to deal with the carjacker, yet he remained unmolested the entire time. None of this is to say the claims of Tossie and Begay should be accepted at face value, but we should be careful not to dismiss the claims simply because they seem outlandish or unreal. Reality is not obliged to be comfortable, nor must it conform to what seems correct. Perhaps we are faced with a poorly understood psychological state that we could all potentially fall victim to, or perhaps we are being visited by beings from another place whose motivations are inscrutable.